This is a video about Chapter 5 and this for $8.99 school. What school leaders need to know about English learners. And Chapter 5, you've already read it, but I wanted to talk about it in some more detail. And it talks about how does someone learn English in school. And rather than focus on language acquisition, I'd like to focus on something a little different that's also in the chapter. And it's issues about education and what you as a teacher and as a school in your school needs to know about your students. And so I'm just going to go through some. And actually, this could be a rubric, but you know, a person could create one from what I'm going to present to you because I've just taken a bunch of notes. And what are some things you need to know? Well, obvious things you need to know and you'll test for will be the language, English language proficiency of the student coming in to see if they need assistance. But that's just really basic, and your ELPA 21 in Nebraska will give you, and several states will give you a score. Later in the chapter, they give you some lists of, you know, beginning, intermediate, there, so forth. But what I want to talk about is some other things that you really need to be curious about, because as an ESL teacher, you have to have a profound curiosity about cultures, and then you have to have a deep interest in finding out everything you can about your students. So what are those things? Well, a big one is formal education, because a person may have some limitations in speaking English, but they may be quite fluent in their own language, and not just fluent, but intellectually fluent. They may have the bics and the calps of French or Spanish or Arabic already well established. So that's something you look for, and that makes a huge difference. It's not just speaking English, but a student who's well established and articulate in their own language. The more they are established, they're capable of dramatic and improvements, and they'll understand difficult concepts that you won't have to teach them things they would already know, maybe about chemical equations or about anthropology terms or music. Maybe they'll know a lot about music. So you have to look at that, and that's very important. And then what do you look for there? Well, this is an area I don't think I've ever seen a book on it. I've seen books about it or that talk about it, but you want to discover, where did they live? Were they in a refugee camp? Were they in a country that was in a state of civil war where education was interrupted? That's the term, interrupted education. Were they in a rural area where education was hit or miss? Sometimes they didn't have books, sometimes they didn't have a teacher, sometimes the students didn't show up. So that, you know, the idea of a year of progress would be pretty difficult. So rural schools tend to be very poor in education, spotty as a general rule. If they live in an urban area, they may have gone to either private or public schools, but the odds are they would have had more exposure to education in an urban area. Now, if they went to a private school, probably they had a good education. You know, you can't assume that in the United States, depends on what the school is, but in most countries, education, the parents take care of that by paying extra. Also, the parents' educational status, are they professionals? Are they business people? Certainly if they're medical doctors or lawyers or something, their child will probably be very well educated even in the home because the parents will read to them, and etc. You may not be able to find out about their reading level, but it would be useful to find out books that they have read or materials they have read, even if it's just the local newspaper. It's going to be very hard to do depending on where they're from. Some places you may have no idea. I don't think there's a test yet, but it'd be interesting if you had kind of a neutral, language neutral, which would be hard to do, but actually be able to discover if they knew a lot about the world. because of exposure to media, computers, etc. Also, the technology, if they had internet, that would be an indication of some expertise, that they would be comfortable with technology. Okay, I mentioned that term interrupted education. Interrupted could be a result of just not having a teacher. It could be a result of the fact they had to flee, that they were in a refugee camp that maybe didn't provide any education, that they were in some kind of a interned area in the United States borders, which you've been reading about, that's really upset me, that maybe no education or nothing was taking place there. There might have been traumatic conditions. And as I mentioned the word traumatic, I'm thinking about those border confinements. Some people call them concentration camps, internment camps, etc. The issue there is, how are they treated? Whatever camp they're in, are they with family? Are they nurtured? Are they isolated? Are they with strangers? We know children suffer if they do not feel safe and secure, even if they get food and water, and etc. But they feel threatened all the time. This can affect brain development. No question about this. This is why I'm so upset about what's going on the American border. So that's another issue to look at. So the conditions, you try to find out everything you can about that student, because it'll give you clues to what needs to be done or what you're facing. And I mentioned trauma and that stuff. So those are the things to look at. Now, here's some examples. Students from Venezuela, which now is virtually collapsed as a country, lack of food. They have an average loss of 15 to 20 pounds per person in the country of Venezuela because of food, interruption of food, and it only goes to the favorites of the leader. People from Iraq have been in all kinds of migrant camps, and not migrant, I would call them refugee camps. Keep those apart. Refugee is usually political upheaval, and migrant is usually people migrating for jobs. It's not supposedly as traumatic, but it can be, and you can get a mix of both. So these are things that it's like a rubric for a human being, and you try to discover as much as you can. So you're a detective, and that's what you're doing. Now, the other part of this chapter that I took several notes about, and I think it's important, and talks about the quality of the ESL teacher, which is you. I feel very confident reading your instruction, and you're concerned about your students. But let's think you're hiring people, or you're going to someday be looking into giving an opinion about whether somebody should be hired. What do you look for? And it's like, well, first of all, you look for traits that you'd find in a good teacher. For instance, they're patient, they're accepting, they're compassionate, they're approachable. You can have good teachers that are hardcore on the outside, but it's better to not have to guess about that if you don't have to. And young teachers should not be strange or peculiar that way. There's something that's very important to me, and I want to mention this, and you can measure this against your own traits, is curiosity. Now, what do I mean by curiosity? Not a lazy curiosity, just kind of vague curiousness, but a real interest in learning about the background of the students, what we just talked about, but also interest in their culture and their language. Maybe you want to learn 5 or 6 phrases in Swahili or Arabic or Sudanese, whatever tribal language. You may want to learn a couple of statements, and feel free to use those with the family, because it shows respect for their culture. And that's a huge, huge thing. I've noticed this with people that people that have a lot of what they call intelligence, emotional intelligence, so they're very approachable and but that may not transfer. That intelligence may not work for another culture. I've run across people that I thought, wow, they're just really a good guy, good person. They relate well to people. But then when they encounter another culture, they kind of freeze up and they're kind of isolated, and they don't want to. They're not risk taking when they encounter that which is much a different stranger than they're used to. Stranger things. When they run into something really strange, they kind of freeze up. They don't know what to do. A lot of times they try to learn the language, but they just butcher it. They're terrible. And that can be unfortunate. It doesn't mean you're going to be a bad teacher. But it would help if you could do a few things. If you have Vietnamese students, learn how to greet the family, learn how to say something positive and say good or okay or whatever you want to say. Even Spanglish is at least you're reaching out, right? Now, what is another trait of a good teacher of ESL? Well, one is finding out the rules in the culture regarding male-female relationships, which is very important. I'll give you some examples. You may notice, and I've noticed this, but I'm not going to try to make myself an expert and say I know this because I don't. But I'll notice in some cultures, males walk in front of females. And usually in American culture, if a man goes into a restaurant with his wife, he doesn't walk 5 feet in front of her. That would almost be considered rude, and you would think, why is that? I've actually seen that, and I always thought, that guy's kind of a jerk, walk in front of his wife, and she's got the kids with her, and he's already doesn't even open the door. So that's kind of the thing with us. Other cultures, they may do that, and there's a different relationship between male and female. And what we might see and think is rude is not something rude. And that's where you have to ask questions. You have to be kind of careful. You don't ask, why is your husband so rude? That's not smart. Rules about touching. For instance, with Muslim women, they cannot shake hands with a male outsider. You can say hello and nod your head or something, but you cannot grab their hands. And if you do, it's really bad form. It's an offense. And I don't care if those people say, well, you're in America, you have to follow our rules. Follow the rules that you grew up with, If you go some other country, you're not going to follow their rules suddenly. Family values, the place of the older person in the family, other than being in the back room, which I expect I will be in a few years. I'm hoping that we'll take up some new, international rules and respect our elders. I'm really big on that now. Religion's a big one too, and clothing. In fact, I'm going to mention the clothing first. I saw a little video today. It showed a woman in Canada. Oh, I was at Malala, the girl from Afghanistan who had been shot by the Taliban, and she survived, and she promoted education for women, and it had a picture of her, and I think she was meeting a Canadian person, could be an ambassador or some official, and it had a little thing on there that said in Canada, if she would just take off her hijab, her head covering, then she'd be allowed to teach school. And I was thinking that's like saying that Abraham Lincoln, he'd be good enough to be in our country and be a leader, but first he'd have to take off his top hat because we'd never respect his top hat. And it seems so shallow that she would have to give up her hijab, which if you know about hijabs, you know that it's a significant cultural rule or marker or custom. You don't rip somebody's hijab off their head. If you think of it this way, a nice way to think of it is think about nuns if you're Catholic. Imagine if somebody told a nun you have to remove your part of your habit or whatever on the head. You have to take that off before we'll let you work here. We'll deal with you. That'd be so completely disrespectful. You'd be shocked if somebody said that. Well, and so I think the head covering, whatever the purpose of it is, if you don't know, it's respectful in the culture, and to cases where people have ripped those off their heads, that's just an absolute assault. Okay. That would be like someone's a priest or someone's a medical doctor and you try to rip off his name tag or something. Man, it would just be absurd to do that. Okay, so you need to find out about things like that. You need to understand that some things are very significant. Well, let's talk about attitude about education and the culture. And that can vary. But generally, what I've found with international refugees, that depending on the child's background or the student's background, and I've seen some that haven't been in school virtually their whole life. One kid I had once, he didn't even know how to stay in his seat. He didn't know that was a rule, and he was in high school. He would get up and wander around like a kindergartner, just wander the room constantly. Someone said, well, there's something wrong with him. I said, yeah, he doesn't know any rules. He thinks it's first grade still because that's all he knows. Okay, customs are important. The custom of being 15 years old in Hispanic culture. I've been to quinceañeras. I said it wrong, but it's very, it's an act. It's kind of like a debutante ball, but it's much more meaningful and it's common. When you're invited to provide I knew a young lady that asked a teacher at school, said, would you sponsor my quinceañera and would you pay for my dress, which cost about $200. And of course, the teacher thought at first, wow, am I getting suckered, or why would she ask me? It's an act of incredible honor for someone, young lady, to ask you to help sponsor or give something for her quinceañera, because it's a community act of respect for the young lady. It sounds real old-fashioned. Some people might, if they're very liberal attitude, they might say, well, this is very sexist. We don't do this for boys. But you have to judge the culture where it is, not by your standards. And so to be asked to help pay for the dress or or sponsor something is an act of respect for you. That means you are a very important person in their lives. So you as an outsider, suddenly you're included in this. You don't say, no, I don't have any money to help you with your dress. That would be humiliating. Some of you may know there are cultures where giving a gift to someone is very important. If you were to actually say, no, thank you, I don't want it, you would actually be disrespecting that person. I believe that's true among Native Americans, but that could just be an old Western I saw. But I do know in many cultures that rejecting a gift is actually like slapping someone in the face, saying, I will not accept anything from you. And so what are the rules for that? You have to discover those. I can't get a book. Now, there are a series of books I really enjoy called Understanding the Thai, or Understanding Arabs, Understanding Chinese, Understanding the English, Understanding Germans. And it's a book for international relations where you learn what are some of the rules in modern Germany. A big one is something people bring up, punctuality. In some cultures, being right on time is actually rude. If you're invited to a party in some cultures, I always say that because there'll be somebody who'll take offense and say, no, it's not true, and then they'll argue with me. And I said, look, I'll just say, keep it generic. I had this happen in Costa Rica. I showed up for the party 10 minutes ahead of time, and it was very awkward. I should not have shown up till an hour later, because when they say 7:30, they mean 8:30, okay? That's just the rules. And if you don't know that, it's a problem. So business appointments may be the same way. Now, it depends, on the people and their relationship, but you don't assume they're deliberately ignoring you or disrespecting you. One time I had a run-in with a lady. She was in a class out in the Northwest I attended, and it was people all over the world flew in for this international conference on different aspects of culture. And it was supposed to start at 8:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock. And right at 8:05, we were all settling down, getting ready, and she was furious. And I kind of wondered, and I didn't want to upset her, but I was almost afraid to say anything. And she said, "It's ridiculous." He said, "We're supposed to start at 8 o'clock, and look at this. He's out in the hallway. It's 8:03, and we haven't started yet. I didn't pay money to fly from Switzerland so he could cheat me out of 5 minutes." And she was angry. Not only that, but she was angry when we took questions from people in the audience or had comments. You would think that would be normal. So, oh, yes, you want people to give their 2 cents. She considered most of the people in the audience too stupid to have an opinion, and she did not want to hear anything about what the other people thought, whether they're Americans, Canadians, or whatever. And she was irritated. She said, "All I want to hear is his ideas, his theories. I don't want to hear discussion about what the audience thinks, because the audience doesn't think. They don't know anything." So I didn't really talk to her anymore. She seemed pretty hardcore. And then I got to thinking about it, and I thought stereotypes, and I said, Swiss make watches. Maybe they're very precise about time. Now, that was silly, but the fact is they were very detailed and very specific. When you meet, what you discuss, what we're going to do, and I want my time spent on that. And it kind of scared me. I mean, it was like, here's this European person who's schooling us on how incompetent we are. I was embarrassed, actually. I wasn't me personally, but I mean, I didn't know what to say. And I said, "Oh, okay." Well, I was afraid to give an opinion on anything because I would be stupid. Okay, so what is the attitude? The attitude, the qualities of a teacher is curiosity, patience, a real intellectual devotion to learning about other cultures. That's huge. And obviously, as a teacher, an interest in how students learn and how best to interact with students, and how best to, it's very important that you see your position as a teacher as a position where you have a relationship with the community. Now, that may sound very good for all you elementary people. You say, well, yeah, of course we do that. But think about like the high school chemistry teacher. He may say, my job's to teach chemistry, and you've had teachers like that. I teach chemistry. I teach subject. They should be ready for it. If they don't understand chemistry, that's their problem. And you've had math teachers like that. If you don't understand math, you need to go back to 8th grade or go back to 5th grade or whatever. Because I just teach people that are ready to learn what I'm ready to teach. As if whether they learn it or not is not my issue. That's not a good teacher. And you find plenty of those in college. I better not say any more, I'll get in trouble. So those are 2 things I wanted to talk about in this chapter. Now, it also talks about principles of language acquisition, but it mentions motivation, meaning you have to have meaningful learning. You want them to have automaticity, it sounds odd. The language should be something where students can grasp it to the point they instantly recognize. But that doesn't happen first. It happens at a point. Motivation, language, ego. Person has an ego, and you don't want to offend them, put them down. People that have been beaten down by math teachers, you can find them all over the place. People that have been beaten down by Spanish teachers. If you've had a bad Spanish teacher and you didn't like Spanish, you didn't like still like tacos or something, but you didn't like much else. That's sad. You like students that are risk takers. Now, I mentioned something in one of my videos. I'm not sure if it was this class, but people that learn and acquire language are often risk takers, and they take chances. And those are some of the best students. And you can find risk takers among some of the more demure students who don't seem to be very aggressive. But I found many young female students, international students, really blossom in a language class because you nurture them, and then their actual devotion, and they don't have the male ego. A lot of cultures have a male ego. The males don't want to make mistakes, and that's true in our culture too. I've seen it with older administrators, and you can't get them to learn Spanish because they don't want to say anything and make a mistake. So risk-taking is a good trait as a student for language teaching. Talks about native language. Sometimes you have a deal where you find out that the big one is the L and the R are two separate sounds in English, but in Korean, and I think Japanese, but there's only one sound, and it's a combination of the L and the R. And so words like that have an L and an R can sound like two different words, rice and lice, totally different meanings. And people say, no, you said this. No, it's a word in between. So you have actual contrasts. You have these very specific sounds that we have two of in English, but only one of in Korean, and I think Japanese too. So the people have that mistake. And then you could go the reverse. What are some sounds in say German, if you're studying German, that we don't have in English? That's a really tough one when we don't even have the sound. We kind of have the sound of the Spanish, the little tilde over the N, and it's kind of like Anya, yeah, and we call it onion, and so we kind of put it down. It's like the N in onion, it's not like O-N-A, onan, no, it's onion or something. So those are useful to point out to people, and I think that's helpful. So that's what I want to say about Chapter 5. I'm going to send you some more stuff, but I just wanted to add this about qualities of teachers and also what you need to know about students, because I think that's very important.